via the internet that we can discuss and we can have good, healthy banter. I pray that your Holy Spirit will touch everyone, even those that are going through their health crisis with still the COVID-19 and those that may be going through other issues in their life. Touch Kimar, touch all the presenters, touch the audio. I pray that you would place your hands at everything would work good. Everybody would hear everybody perfectly. And those that may be coming on, I pray, Lord God, that you will open their minds and hearts and let's all have a very healthy and positive discussion. I ask you this in the name of Jesus, Lord. I ask you, cover us in your spirit and your blood. Thank you, Lord. In the name of Jesus, and everybody says, Amen.
Thank you very much, Comrade Bascom. This evening, we look forward to a very riveting discussion from our panelists. But first, I'd like to say good evening again to everyone who's here. Good evening to our President, Comrade Blackett, and all the party members and the general public who are tuned on this evening. Again, my name is Sima Short, and I'll be your host and moderator today.
Nah, they ain't got a proper way for it there.
Comrades, please mute your microphones if you're not speaking, so that you do not get the feedback coming in. Thank you. Right, so as I was saying, let's get right into this evening's discussion. We're discussing the first Republican estimates and its implications for Barbados. And our panel this evening is made up of three experienced gentlemen whom you may be quite familiar with in the area of finance and economics. Our first panelist is well-known Pro Vice Chancellor, Professor Justin Robertson, currently at the University of West Indies. Carlos Fort, who is an economist, is based in Canada, who has been contributing significantly to the public discourse as it relates to the financial and economic state of the country. And we also have, who's not here with us as yet, Dr. Inc., who's the former parliamentary secretary in the Ministry of Finance and a former chairman of the NAS and also a former, well, yes, still a politician. So let's welcome our panel, and we hope to have a very interesting and engaging discussion. I also like to say good evening to the media as well, and I hope that you follow our discussion keenly, as I'm sure that our panel has some very interesting things to say. So my take as it relates to leading this discussion is that many persons wanted to know in the country why we were not given a budget sooner, and how come, thanks to the delivery of the mini budget, persons were not too sure as to why we did not have a budget before now. We even had the former president of the DLP, the people publicly calling for one to tackle the social and economic measures from COVID-19. But there was a significant occurrence within the public finances, which would have changed the dynamic as it relates to how the country moves forward. So my first question to the panel, and I want you to connect your questions back to the estimates again. The public finance management bill. Can you shed some light on that? And you can shed some light to the public as to the new dynamics and new delivery of the budget, and why you're seeing a budget taking so long to come and the different changes as it relates to delivery? I would ask Professor Robinson to take the lead on that one.
Okay, so thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. So the estimates of revenue and expenditure is the document that is required by law in Barbados. I mean, it gives the government authority to spend money. And Barbados' financial year runs from the 1st of April to March 31st. So the current spending authority will run out at the end of this month. So it is critical just as a purely a matter of law and the running of the government to have estimates passed. A budget is somewhat more optional. In a sense, a budget is not theoretical, is not technically required by our law. A budget is where a government will choose to signal what are my priorities, what am I doing different. And what we have seen to some extent is the two exercises which have been separated in the past, a tendency to merge them. When we look at the current estimates for 2022-23, it is probably not surprising that we have a budget because the deficit projected in these estimates is larger than what many would think would be consistent with the targets of the IMF program, and some of the funding to make up that deficit is not identified in these estimates. So I certainly was looking out to see if there were any additional measures, which is what would come in a budget, to attempt to really give a smaller deficit. So that would be my response to what you threw out there. And maybe as we go on, if you can maybe give some sharing privilege, I can maybe share with our audience, what the numbers look like in the estimates for this year, so they can see that gap that I'm talking about.
Well, thank you, Dr. Robertson, for your contribution. Carlos, I want to ask you a question here. How do you see the estimates of Barbados for this year? What are some of the upsides that you see from it, and what are some of the downsides that you see from the estimates that were released recently?
So before I get into that question, let me follow on.
Carlos, we can't hear you. Your mic may still be muted.
Are you hearing me? Can you hear me?
Slightly.
I'm hearing him, but not loud, not quite clearly. But I don't think he's muted. Can you hear me, Carlos?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm hearing you a bit better, but I don't know. I'm hearing you, but not loud and clear.
I'll try to speak a little louder and see if that helps.
Yeah, that's excellent.
Okay, great. Yeah, just to follow on before I answer that question, Kimar, I just want to follow on what Professor Robinson said with respect to the estimates and the budget, and why we didn't have a budget for the past 2 years. As Professor Robinson indicated, the budgets as we know them are not required by law, and that has lent itself to some degree of discretion as to when a government brings a budget. Of course, by convention, I think there are only 1 or 2 instances prior to this administration where we would have had a year elapsing without having a budget. I think this happened on 1 occasion during the Oinatha administration, and a previous occasion with Mr. Barrow when he had, I think, a substitute fireside chat, so to speak. I would wish to characterize what not only Barbadians understand as a budget, but also other countries within the Commonwealth that have budgets every year. Though in their case, in cases of Canada, the UK, believe in Australia, their budgets are probably required by, well, in Canada's case for sure, is required by statute. The late former Prime Minister Oinatha characterized his budgets as the statements, the economic and financial policy statements, because that's what the budget really is. It lays out comprehensively what the government's economic, social, and financial policies are for the coming 2 to 3 years. And that is important because it provides stakeholders, the general public, the various interest groups with some degree of certainty as it relates to the overall macroeconomic context, both the international, regional, and domestic context that the government would be operating in the year to come. And it lays out basically what the government's priorities are by way of policy. Are there going to be any tax increases or tax reductions? Basically, what is in it for me, I suppose, from the point of view of most Barbadians, but also from the point of view of industries, the various sectors. What is the government's policies going to be with respect to incentives to generate or facilitate growth in a range of areas? And for these reasons, the budget is very important. I do believe. Now, some have sought to suggest that the estimates is the real budget, and in an accountant sense, it is. But the estimates is in no way a substitute for a comprehensive statement of the economic, financial, and social policies which the government is seeking to contemplate, which speaks to economic growth, employment generation, foreign exchange earnings. How does government propose to finance its deficit? What are going to be the sources of financing and the implications thereof? And therefore, certainly given the scale of challenges that the country has been confronting since the COVID pandemic, and now with the uncertainty with the war in Europe, it could only be a dereliction of duty not to have a budget where government lays out something resembling a comprehensive growth and financial management plan over the course of the next year to 3 years. Now, with respect to these the estimates of expenditure and how I would characterize it, certainly I would again echo something that Professor Robinson said earlier. Given the obligations or the commitments under the existing BERT program, which is scheduled to expire later this year, as a result of the pandemic, some of those targets were eased or relaxed, and the implication of that, the IMF has already spoken to it, is that in the years to come, government would have to make up for some of the lost opportunity, some of the fiscal consolidation gains that were lost over the course of the last 2 years. And it's against that context that a plan estimates which contemplates a planned deficit of 3.3% of GDP is somewhat surprising for economists and some of the other financial observers looking on. So that perhaps is one of the first surprises of the estimate. The implications of that plan 3.3% fiscal deficit is a revenue gap of just above a deficit or a funding gap of just above $800 million in the next fiscal year beginning next month. And
So Carlos,
yeah,
not to interrupt you, but I mean, I don't want you to lose the audience here. I want the audience to understand what you're saying exactly. Fiscal consolidation. I'm sure it may be a big, economic term, what's not. We want the public to understand what that means for the average Barbadian. What does the funding gap mean for the average Barbadian? Because they want to know about jobs. You have nurses protesting about pay. People, we experience significant fall off in revenue. Activity, the country was under a COVID period. And were people for sure not working. Businesses have closed. What like bills going up, water. So what does those terms mean for the average Barbadian or the average viewer here this evening?
Yes, so feel free to interrupt at any time, as is your role as the moderator. And many of the questions that you ask essentially highlights the importance of having a budget, which we will have tomorrow, which would speak by way of policy to those, I suppose, contemporary macroeconomic challenges, but also the bread and butter issues that people are concerned about, or relief from the cost of the surging cost of living that we're currently experiencing, opportunities for employment with respect to job growth and economic growth, and so on. The estimates more or less set out government's essentially financial budget for how those things would be made possible. So when I speak to fiscal consolidation, it means government essentially, to the extent that it can, not spending too much beyond its means. So essentially bringing the revenues and expenditure closer to balance, as opposed to having expenditure that exceeds significantly the revenues that are being that would be generated from taxation and user fees and the like. And with these estimates, it is projected or planned that expenditure would exceed revenue by up to $800 million in the next financial year. And that is quite significant. But it is important to point out that the last financial year, and on account of COVID, on account of the 400 million loss in revenue with the economy shut down and so on, that the government just ran a deficit of 4.9% of GDP. And what has that meant? It meant that in the last 2 years, the government has borrowed over 2 billion Barbados dollars. And these estimates contemplate another 800 million dollars in borrowing over the course. So what it tells us is that certainly the government is living or planning to live outside of its means over the course of the next financial year, and that does provide some constraints as to what government can do with respect to generating growth, employment, providing relief from the surging cost of living, and so on and so forth. And so the details around that framework would come in the budget tomorrow.
I want to ask you, you spoke about borrowing, additional $800 million of borrowing. I guess it's split between the two, between foreign financing and domestic financing. So help us to understand what is happening here, because Dr. Robinson, I want to get you in here to answer this question, because you reported in the newspaper article saying that there's nothing wrong with government borrowing, especially in a time based on there's money available cheaply in terms of interest rates. So help us to understand, in a situation like this, borrowing an additional $800 million under conditions like this, an international monetary fund program as well, and basically seeking to roll back government expenditure through the year. So could you help us to understand the implications of that?
Okay, so thanks for that. And I just letting you know, Jepta is here in case you had, because I'm seeing Jepta on my screen there, looking very comfortable. But I was asking, because I always think it's important when we are having these conversations that the general public, I feel a lot about public education, that the public is aware of the facts, and the estimates is a public document. And I was hoping I could get sharing privilege. I was speaking to Ashton there, so that the public can see, and this is a public document. I don't think you have to be a big numbers person to really read that. So Ashton, have you made us co-host so I could just share that with the audience here and the members of the public following, so that we kind of kick off our discussion with people having a sense as to what these numbers are. I think you have to make me a co-host or something. Because as Carlos rightly pointed out, the deficiency of the excessive expenditure over revenue is 867,613,276, and that's coming on a similar number the prior year. But I'm still not getting those. Is Ashton able to get that done? Or if not, I can just move on.
In the meantime, we can just move on. For the questions on the floor about the additional borrowing and how does that affect us right now in the
Okay,
pandemic.
so why does a need for borrowing arise? If the expenditure that you expect to undertake is greater than the revenue, then you have to fill that up, that gap. Now, borrowing, I mean, we've had a lot of discussion around that in Barbados. And my comments that you mentioned, I would want to that I think we don't want to get into discussion that borrowing by definition is bad. And that all borrowing is bad. It depends on the amount you are borrowing relative to your income. What are you borrowing for? So I mean, so many of us borrow to build a house, buy a car. It allows you. So I don't think borrowing in and of itself is bad. It's really what you are borrowing for, the borrowing relative to your income, and the terms and conditions of the borrowing. So the borrowing that we have been doing recently has been from IDB and others, and those are relatively low interest rates with long paybacks. It's quote unquote cheap money, but it is still money you have to pay back. A debt is something you do have to pay back. So we do have to manage the level of borrowing, because then eventually what happens is that debt service can take up so much of the government revenue that money that should go to fix roads, hospitals, etc., goes to service debt. So I think that's something we have to be cognizant of. And as we continue to engage in more borrowing, at what point do we sort of get into that where the borrowing becomes somewhat counterproductive? I don't know if that answers the question. I don't know if that answers the question you were raising.
Yeah, I want to raise the point with you here. As it relates to government and the country, as it seems at this point that any government administration must now anchor its development agenda around a borrowing relationship with the IMF. And if we recall, Professor Owen-Arthur would have warned Barbados against developing that type of a relationship where we depend on the IMF heavily for so much support. But we had things that we get restructuring, which would have hampered our ability to go to international financial markets. And then there was basically a drying up of international finance for Barbados, which is where we had a low reserve problem in the first place. So in a situation where the only type of investment available is really Chinese financing and IMF financing, at what point do we say to ourselves, the more we continue to borrow and still not make the corrections at home as it relates to the running of the government in terms of efficiency, in terms of the state-owned enterprises, that continue to be a problem for the IMF. Every Barbadian can relate to a story about some type of inefficiency or the type in government. So at what point do we try to fix our internal processes outside of that type of borrowing relationship with the IMF? And as that's the journey to get in on this question, please. Yeah, sure. So we're not getting Jester, but Carlos, I'm gonna let you get that one, and then Dr. Robinson, you can you're now co-host, so then you can display your presentation.
Jactor is muted, so if he can unmute himself, he can probably go ahead. In the meantime, what I would say is this. So there's no issue being in an IMF program per se. Indeed, I am on public record of advocating that the government go to the IMF or embark on the IMF program. I think as early as probably 2017 or 2016, and it lead up to the 2018 general election. My assessment was that regardless of whichever party won the election, that the country would have embarked on the IMF program because it was necessary. And certainly at the time, the debt servicing was a significant burden. It was consuming almost 25 cents in the dollar of revenue. The Barbados was virtually in a debt trap. And as with anything, you have to deal with the root problems of a issue in order to solve it. What the IMF would have brought to bear was cheap access to financing and some credibility and discipline. So once you enter IMF program, there are milestones that you have to meet. And so we've seen the benefit of being in the program. What results from that credibility is that you're then able to access other multilateral financing from Caribbean Development Bank, IDB, etc. And just to give a little flavor of that, the financing that is contemplated for the coming fiscal year, of that 800 million, only 96 million is expected to come from the IMF. The balance, the vast majority of the other 600 million in foreign financing will come from multilateral institutions. The World Bank, for example, 200 million, Inter-American Development Bank, 271 million, the People's Republic of China, 89 million, and so forth. So entering the IMF program and against the background of a country that's having difficulty servicing its debt and accessing new financing on the international capital markets, that relationship has opened up access to other multilateral financing. So the other thing is that the IMF is not the creature that it was in the 90s and earlier as well. We have seen from during this COVID pandemic, Barbados being in the IMF program, the IMF agreed to relax the targets to create or facilitate more fiscal room for the government to maneuver. The government was able to access additional financing on top of what was agreed under the program. And this wasn't unique to Barbados because financing was made available for all IMF member countries. And there was also grants of special drawing rights, which are grant funds that came from the IMF. So I don't want to create the impression that being in the IMF program is a bad thing in of itself. But to the core of your question is the magnitude of borrowing that we've seen over the last 2.5 years sustainable? The answer, quite frankly, is no. The government's budget, so the estimates is about 2.9 it's a $2.9 billion budget. The government borrowed just about 1.3 billion in 2020, and another 700 or so million in the last financial year, which brings it to about $2 billion. And now it's contemplated another 800 million. That is a significant amount of money, which is bringing the stock of central government's debt closer to where we started when the current administration took over in 2018. The difference is that the interest rate and the debt servicing is a lot lower than what obtained before. But if we continue at this pace, Barbados can again find itself in the debt trap pretty quickly once again, with debt servicing taking up more and more of government's revenue, which provides less revenue for capital infrastructure spending, spending for education, health, etc. And the other factor to consider is that most of this debt is foreign debt. It's a sharp departure from the debt management policy of Barbados over the post-independence history, where we previously relied more on domestic debt. You can roll over domestic debt as it comes due, but foreign debt, you can't roll it over in the same way, and you have to repay in foreign exchange. So what we are seeing here is of some concern, because in the future, and not too distant future as well, we're going to have to pay back this debt in foreign exchange.
You raised some very important issues.
You hearing me now, Kimar?
Oh, yes, that. We're going to get you in a second.
Good, thank you.
You raised some very important issues. One of them being that majority of the financing available to government over the last couple of years is mainly foreign financing. And we are in a situation now where we lost our travel receipts and the tourists are not coming. And even Dr. Robertson raised the issue about as it relates to the foreign finances of Barbados. And many persons are asking about the reserves and issues like that. But another important point that you raised, Carlos, is the difference between the management policy, the foreign and the domestic debt. We had our central bank available to us traditionally to finance us. There were some changes made to the legislation which would have reduced the central bank's ability to finance some government operations, and therefore with that restriction in place, that restriction led the government into the foreign market for financing. And I really say that may not be the most sustainable thing to do, given the position that we're at globally, with the war and all going up to war, which is extremely problematic for Barbados. So in a couple of months' time, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where we need to earn foreign exchange. Not we are going to have to extend, or possibly extend our program with the IMF, as it was intended to come to the end around maybe like October, I believe. So just a couple of points that we are going to have you, and then Justin, I'm going to let you have your time of the presentation.
Thanks, Kimar. You hearing me?
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Having some technical difficulties. Good evening to you, the moderator. Good evening to Dr. Robinson. This is the only time I get to see him. Also, Carlos, unless we pass one another on the road in St. Philip. But what I must say is, for me, the estimate tells me that we are coming out of the tail end of the IMF extended fund facility. And reviewing the estimates, I look for the social obligation of government to the people of Barbados, because I always say that government is 90% social obligation and the private sector is 90% profit. The other 10% is profit, is government. But we are now we are into the tail end of the extended fund facility. And as I said before, what are the implications for Barbadians? Looking at these estimates, it says to me that we are going to extend that facility. And with that extension, what measures are going to come so that Barbadians can prepare themselves? What measures are there for us as far as the economy is concerned? And then what are the debt strategies? looking at the borrowings and what, as far as the debt is concerned, I was looking for what is government exit strategy as far as the borrowings are concerned, and I haven't seen it. What I am saying is that we are more dependent on international borrowings to fix a local problem. And these borrowings, in my opinion, when you take out the project expenditure, the side of the project, what we are looking at, that we are using monies in unproductive, and that is what we are going to use monies in unproductive ways to fix a problem that is generated locally. Yes, we know that COVID had an impact, but I think the time has arrived when we have to stop using COVID and look for what are the economic growth principles that I'm looking for. What are the debt management principles that I'm looking for? And what is this going to do to the lives of Barbadians as far as employment is concerned? What are we doing? These estimates haven't told me what are the policies to control the cost of living that is spiraling. That is what I'm looking for when I say the social obligation of the estimates. Thank you.
Well, I guess we're only gonna have to wait at least a day more. Really
Yes.
official budget comes. Before you got here, you were speaking about the public financial management bill, which supports some changes in the way that the budget is delivered. And you raised a point about debt management strategy. There's also a component for a medium-term fiscal strategy. You spoke a lot about the Accountant General's report. Included in this bill was the requirement for the Accountant General to lay the financial statements to government. We have not seen an Accountant General report for some time. And I suspect one of the big components of being in the IMF program would be to meet some of the requirements as it relates to the state-owned enterprises, again, the water authority and sanitation and the like. And if you're speaking transparency, reports that the Accountant General's report and the other specific financial requirements as it relates to reporting the government debt management strategy, which is supposed to be presented to both cabinet and parliament, and printed on the official government website by the director of finance, who has taken on an even bigger role as it relates to the changes on the Public Financial Management Act. So hopefully tomorrow we could see these new changes coming up in delivery of the budget, where we will have greater transparency for persons like I and Dexter and Carlos and different interest groups across Barbados could have access to the financial information of government, so that we can make our own determinations as to the direction of government. Given the fact that we do not have an opposition at the moment, I think it is important for the government to live up to these proposed standards in this bill, because it will give the citizens on the new Republic system ease of mind. Dr. Robinson, over to you. You're muted.
Yeah, thanks again. So, I mean, the estimates is an intimidating document, hundreds of pages, you have a long debate. And what I often suggest to people, when the estimates come out, the first thing I do is go to this table 8. The same table is there every year. Table 8 really gives you a very quick overview in one place. Very simple, you don't have to be a numbers person. The estimates for this year, 2022-23, what was approved last year and what was the revised for last year, because the word is an estimate. So certainly, what do we see from the estimates, as Carlos was saying, is that for 2022-23, the government projects to spend 3.6 billion Barbados dollars, and it plans to collect this in revenue. So there's a shortfall of 867,613,276. So based on the government's projected spending, they plan to spend 867 million more than they expect to collect in the upcoming year. And for the last financial year, they spent 869 more than they collected. Now, clearly, once this is a negative, the money has to come from somewhere. So again, as we see here, we are relying a lot on foreign financing. So there was a shortfall of 869 million last year. We borrowed 720 million of that from these different institutions, and the remainder from domestic. This year, we are looking to get 466 million of that 867 from foreign and 401 from domestic. I think what is significant, which is what I am looking for with interest in the budget tomorrow, is that of the domestic financing of 401, 276 million falls under the category of other, which essentially is saying to you that of this projected shortfall of 867 million, we expect to get 466,100 from foreign, and these are probably loans that we know we are going to get, things that have been signed. We're going to issue 125 million in treasury bonds locally, but this is an amount of money that is yet to be confirmed. So how are we gonna close this funding gap in the estimates to something, in the budget is something I would be looking for. Are we going to act as Carlos and I was saying earlier, given that we are in an IMF program coming out of COVID where we were given relaxed targets, are we really going to go ahead and run a shortfall of this amount, which would require this amount of borrowing? Those don't seem consistent. So is the government going to come with any new expenditure cuts or new revenue raising measures to close this gap? If we are going to go with this, then how are we going to get the rest of the financing that is required? Because effectively 276.5 million is not yet signed up. So I think, again, persons trying to get a quick look at what your government plans to spend your money on, where it plans to collect the money from, what is the gap, how it's going to be filled. This table 8 in the estimates document really gives you a quick overview of what's projected for this year and what happened last year.
And if I may,
Carl, before you go ahead, I just want to raise a quick issue with into a bigger regional issue. We've got also to be foreign debt as well. Dr. Robertson, can you scroll to the page where it says sinking funds assets?
I don't know what that page is, so I can't scroll to that.
Yeah, let's click Control F on the page and type in sinking funds, and it would come up. But in the meantime, what we saw happening in Bahamas, the government sinking funds is basically a fund that the government would pay debt into to ensure that when the debt becomes due, that the government has the ability to pay out of that sinking fund. What we saw happening in the country was a rapid depletion of the sinking funds to a figure that is now only at 14 million. And the government plans to raise that sinking fund asset to 200 million in one financial year. Now, my concern really stems to the fact that occurred in the Bahamas Parliament is that they recently leased out their sinking fund assets to JP Morgan Chase, which is an international bank. And you had the parliamentary opposition raising their concerns and queries about the government doing such acts. So I'm not suggesting that our government is doing something like that, but I'm saying that with such a rapid increase in one financial year, one needs to raise concerns as to why the government is putting assets in there from 14 million straight up to 200 million at such a drastic pace. So these are some issues that we need to pay attention to, especially when you're focusing on foreign financing and foreign reserves. But Carlos, we want to get you in there.
Yeah, so I'll go in reverse chronological order. So Kimar, the issue you raised about the sinking funds, I don't think that is a big concern. In as much as you can think of sinking funds as the government just setting aside money, either from its revenues or from borrowing, to pay future borrowing when it comes due. And Barbados did have quite substantial, I don't remember the exact figures, but there were hundreds of millions of dollars in sinking funds in Barbados during the UNATA administration in particular. I can speak to that because I worked in the Ministry of Finance during that time. And with the onset of the Great Recession and the difficulties that we know Barbados experienced during that time, those sinking funds essentially were drawn down to service debt. And so I think what the Motley administration is seeking to do is really just to restore that buffer of having funds set aside so that when debt falls due in the future, that there's some funds that you can draw on to pay that debt. And so that is good financial management, I think. I'm not too familiar with the situation that you refer to in Bahamas, but I suspect what may be happening there is that the government may have elected to essentially have that those funds managed so that they can get some investment return on those funds rather than just having them sit on a bank account with relatively low interest. And that essentially just helps to buffer or build up the fund until debt falls due, and then the government draws on those funds. So I don't think that is too much of a concern, in as much as it is just an indication of good financial management. And you indicated that it may be jumping from 14 million to 100 million or 200 million, but that may just mean that some of this borrowed funds would be will go into the sinking fund, so they aren't all going to be expended, and that is not a bad thing. With respect to what the numbers Professor Robinson presented, which is still on the screen, I just wanted to touch on this very important point that he made with respect to this $276 million. This, you can think of it as a financing shortfall, because to have such a big number in other signals that the government isn't sure where it's going to get that money from, and it underscores that what some of us already recognize. One of the downsides of the debt restructuring program is that it has the domestic investors who would ordinarily invest in government paper, the banks, the insurance companies, and individuals and pensioners, etc. They're a little skittish about lending to the government, having had what would be from their point of view, a bad taste left in their mouth, resulting from the debt restructuring. But of course, we all know that not just Barbados, but the world has been grappling with a very difficult economic situation due to COVID and the resulting lockdowns, and persons perhaps don't have the confidence that even if they may be willing to lend to government, that maybe they could end up in a similar situation in the foreseeable future where there's another debt restructuring. And so what this other figure tells us, and maybe it'll come in the budget tomorrow, is where does government intend to source funds to fill that gap. At present, they don't know. And with respect to the 125 million treasury notes, we do know from the central bank's reporting that the take up on those treasury notes have not been very good. And in the interim, the central bank would essentially buy them, which is akin to printing money or central bank financing of government.
Not here.
So I just wanted to make that point as Professor Robinson was presenting.
No.
And if you could have Marion Griffith mute their mic, that would be great.
Thank you, Carlos, for your interjection. We have a hand from Maureen Folder, so we want to take her question. But before we do, Doctor, I wanted to get your opinion quickly. Because we've been hearing quite a bit about pension reform, and persons are still not clear as to what's going to happen with their pensions. One of the promises to the IMF was that Barbados was intended to reform its pension system and the pension scheme. We know that the goalpost has been constantly moving, and I suspect at this point, within the estimate or within the budget, sorry, that there should be some push to reform the pension system. So we know that you have years of experience within the pension scheme. So if you could give us an opinion on that quickly.
Quickly, two things quickly. Let me speak to the sinking fund issue quickly, and then I'm going to go to the pensions. If you are going to borrow, what international underwriters and international lenders do is that they examine your sinking fund to see if that sinking fund is properly managed. Because the actual amount that was in the sinking fund at March 21st was 14.9 million. And then the projected amount, March 22nd, was 182.2 million. Now for March 2023, they are projecting $208 million in the sinking fund. Now, remember, Barbados defaulted on its international loans. So we have a risk premium that has to be considered. Now, if the government is going to project that that sinking fund is going to increase in assets because it can be a negative against you, based on what we have with this deficit, it can be a negative against you, because what international lenders would do is ask to see the management of your sinking fund over a number of years. And if in their opinion, not that they won't lend, but if in their opinion that sinking fund wasn't properly managed, or they're seeing it as not as the movement of assets are not what they're supposed to be, they can increase the interest rate on your loans. Just a quick synopsis. Not that you won't get lending or you won't be able to borrow, but you may borrow at a higher interest rate. That is how sinking funds, and that is why you establish a sinking fund for the payment for bond payments. Bond payments must go into that sinking fund. Now, the amendment to the Pensions Act, the government, that was one of the main platforms on which the government borrowed money from the IMF when the Prime Minister wrote to Christine Lagarde, and they said they would amend the Pension Act. It was supposed to be done in 2019, it wasn't. Then we were given a date, 2020. We were given another date, 2021, and now we are into 2022. The IMF has spoken about it. But what we must look at and what we must understand, if we are going to look at pension reform, you must also, because pensions is different from a pension is a part of retirement benefits. What is going to happen, and this is my as I would call it, my concern, what is going to happen to what we call gratuities? Now we have a retirement date. We do not have, by law, you can retire anytime, but you have what you call a retirement age, and the gratuities are calculated based on. So that is where my concern is. My other concern is that if you are going to amend pensions, you have to look carefully at what was done as far as pensions in the public service. And the reasons why the public service pensions are different from the private sector is because government had to use an incentive to keep public servants within the public service. I can give you an example, a quick example. An accountant in the private sector works for $165,000 a year. An accountant in the public sector works about 96,000, if so much, a year. A PS that is equivalent to a CEO in the private sector works about $140,000, $150,000 a year. I would have to double check it. But a CEO in the private sector with similar responsibilities makes about 300,000. So government says, look, what are the incentives? And I have said it before, we have to look at, if we are going to amend that Pensions Act, we have to consider what are the salaries. If you are going to ask public servants to contribute, they are already contributing through the NIS payments that they make that are deducted every month from the salaries. But then if you're going to ask them for any greater contribution, it has to be looked at what are the salary base and how many persons are going to come into the public service to support anything like that on a yearly basis. Those are some of the critical areas we have to look at, and we have to look at the gratuities and then compare that to the private sector.
All right, thank you, Jaddo, for your very informative contribution on the pensions in Barbados. Pensions will be a very contentious issue for Barbados. We have the elderly population, majority, and the conversation needs to be had as it relates to our public service, how public servants get their benefit upon working for the government of Barbados for their 33 and a third. So we definitely need to have that conversation, and whenever the pension reform comes throughout this financial year, we would expect an independent, a political committee with the respective persons, the insurance professionals, the actuaries, the economists, the financial persons, even the layman persons who could sit on this independent committee to observe the intended changes in the pension system in Barbados. So what we're saying basically is government without representation of trade unionism, and we fear that workers in Barbados may not benefit from as they should as it relates to any changes in the pension system. Maureen, we will take your question now, please.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for a very interesting and insightful discussion. Now, I really need to get a sense that we are effectively navigating through this debt situation, and that we have the policy space, if that's the term to use, to help us through it while shielding the most vulnerable from further dislocations and perhaps preventing other groups from slumping into the vulnerable positions that we want to help the less advantaged or less fortunate out of. Now, I understand we need external financing and investment, and leave that there. But isn't it also true to say, and I guess the more learned people than me can help me with this question, but isn't it also true to say that an increase in external debt finance investment could lead to a rise in the debt to GDP ratio? Now, let's say there were to be a reduction in the external financing. Couldn't that ultimately contribute to reducing the rise in Barbados's debt to GDP ratios? That's another question. And the other question is, can we depend on internal or domestic investment financing to assist us? Or would an increase in external investment finance be the ideal thing to help us through this precarious crisis that we're in? I'm open to some answers that will give me some confidence, so that when I listen to the budget tomorrow, I could understand why certain things are being done, and it will give me a sense of confidence and hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, Maureen. I want to open the question to the floor, but I want to add tad bit to your question in terms of providing some content. The Central Bank of Barbados and the NAS at one time used to finance basically treasury bills from government in large numbers, intended to provide a domestic financing. I'm not necessarily going into the particulars of it, but that's really considered to be domestic financing from those type of institutions or whatever. The commercial banks also provided financing to the government as well. But the investment culture in Barbados is not as it should be. We have a stock exchange that's basically dormant. There's no real financial market for persons to invest in and see returns worth the risk. And there are other countries in the world offering better investment climate as it relates to the type of or the idea that I'm getting the things that you're interested in. I believe the time has come in Barbados to develop some type of financial market, again, one that actually works. And Dr. Robinson has been doing some work in this area as it relates to developing what they call a capital or functioning capital market in Barbados to allow for investment both in Barbados locally through the different financial institutions, even getting persons with the average taxpayer involved in that as well, and opening up assessments of financing, but in a more modern day digital age, which is more friendly to the business climate. But I will pass on to the panel. But I think Dr. Robinson will have quite a bit to say about that.
Okay, so in terms of answering Maureen's question, so I mean, whether you borrow domestically or foreign, it is going to increase your debt to GDP ratio one. So I don't think the mix of debt, foreign or domestic, doesn't impact your debt to GDP. It's really the amount of borrowing you're doing, whatever the source, relative to your GDP, that will determine the debt to GDP. And I mean, that's one of our concerns. So when Carlos and I say that when you look at the deficit in the estimates, and the amount of borrowing that is implied is not consistent with the stated economic policy of the government. Barbados' economic policy is supposed to be anchored by us getting to a target of a debt to GDP ratio of 60% by 2033. So the debt to GDP ratio increasing at this time is not consistent in terms of meeting that target. So what I would be interested in seeing in the budget is, are we going to actually go with this level of deficit, or is the budget going to attempt to close that gap so that we have a deficit that is a deficit, and by extension, a level of borrowing that is more consistent with the IMF requirements, and also where our economic policy is supposed to be grounded in getting to that 60% debt to GDP ratio. And I'm seeing the question, right now, the foreign borrowing from the IMF, IDB is significantly cheaper than local borrowing would be. But I think, as Carlos said earlier, one of the negatives of the debt restructuring from 2018 is that the government's ability to tap the domestic capital markets for financing is limited, because locals, having been burnt in 2018, their appetite for government debt is still very much open to question. Barbados accessing new commercial debt, new debt on the open market, is still very open to question in terms of people's investors' appetite for that debt after the debt restructuring. So for better or worse, right now we are stuck, or we are forced to rely what we call that multilateral financing, IDB, CAF, IMF, European Investment Bank, and so on, some China financing, because as a result of the debt restructuring, our capacity to tap private capital markets is very much open to question.
Yeah. So excellent contribution. But I hope he answered your question, Maureen. But he opened to another point. I guess I want to place to Carlos. Capital work or capital expenditure. What capital expenditure? Basically, the money government will spend on the proposed higher, the proposed large roads and other infrastructure investments. But we are seeing within the economic deliveries of the government, even in the economic statement delivered to the country, even the proposed stimulus packages, which would have brought tourism investments to Barbados. We're seeing that those investments are not coming on stream. So I wanted to ask your opinion, Carlos, on government proposed expenditure programs to actually invest into the country over the proposed year. What do you think it could be like, as you see the possibility of some new hotel brands, any possibility for any investment across the economy, any investment in any of the state-owned enterprises? Could you give us some type of hope as it relates to any area of the economy that the government can invest heavily or intends to invest in as it relates to capital expenditure that would benefit Barbadians on the whole?
Yeah, well, I hope as well, and I'm sure that we will hear a lot about projects in the pipeline, both private sector projects and projects that government would be the lead on. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about that tomorrow. This is an area that has been a concern for me, though, because I think there are some structural issues in the Barbados economy that is making it difficult to see these projects come forward. And the fact is that going in reverse chronological order, we have heard this government tell us about the billions of dollars in projects when in 2020 during the pandemic. During the election, the prime minister, or the lead up to the election, prime minister said she's not too concerned about growth. There will be growth this year. It will be significant, and that there are proponents of projects that would be coming forward that would lead that growth. But we also heard the same thing under the Stewart administration. St. Clair, former Minister of Finance St. Clair at the time, spoke to many of these same projects coming forward, and they did not. So what that tells me as an economist is that there's some structural issues here that aren't necessarily administration specific. But then there's also the overall domestic and global economic context. A lot of these projects are hotel related investments, and certainly the hotel investment calls for is highly capital intensive. You're talking about investments in plant and that type of thing. And investors would want to time their investment or the completion of these projects to coincide with when the economy is on the upswing. So it's a largely tourism dependent economy. So you want to have some confidence in your timing of the phasing of these projects, that by the time it's finished, global tourism would be buoyant. The tourism numbers in Barbados would be, or the demand would be somewhat robust. Because what tends to happen is that you generate most of your revenues, and therefore your return on that investment in the earlier stages, or when the plant is new and fresh and so on, before you have to contemplate renovations again. And therefore, I believe that with the onset of the economic dislocation from COVID, that investors would have pretty much delayed the beginning of those projects. And if the outlook, both presented by the government by way of policy and performance, and also investors' outlook in terms of how the global economic context is looking, then they would be more inclined to bring forward those projects. The other thing too is where those projects are foreign financed commercially, or the credit rating does have an impact on the return on investment calculations, and that also impacts on the investment decision as to whether to bring forward these projects and the timing of bringing forward these projects. So having said all that, that's why I said when I begin to speak like you, I also hope, because I do understand the finance and economics behind why these projects may have been delayed. And we all know what is happening currently. Certainly the industrial countries, the post-COVID recoveries have been quite strong, but now we have the war in Europe, which is driving up commodity prices and so on. And that is, if it continues, that is going to lead to a downgrade of the economic outlook in terms of economic growth, and with knock-on implications for Barbados. And what I'm saying is that the uncertainty that we are seeing could lead to these projects being delayed or postponed. So I, like you, look forward to hearing what the government will tell the country and the assurances that it may be able to give, both in terms of laying out a comprehensive growth plan, because that's where the government's fiscal situation is helped to the extent that the economy grows, revenues increase, particularly the value-added tax and other indirect taxes, imports and duties and so on, that it naturally would close the funding gap because the expenditure is somewhat more static. And so those are the things that I would like to hear tomorrow. I think the past 2.5 years, a lot of the policy emphasis, but by necessity perhaps, has been on accessing foreign borrowing from multilateral institutions. I would like to see a pivot in Barbados' foreign policy to more emphasis on attracting investment, foreign direct investment. So a combination of foreign direct investment in the types of projects and maybe others. There are some investors that have indicated some interest in the alternative energy sector with the attractive 15% return that is built in. And there've been some talk about the medical marijuana industry and so on, among others. But the point is that attracting foreign direct investment is absolutely critical, combined with, as one of your earlier questions, government increasing its capital expenditure program, which is small relative to the potential scale of foreign direct investment coming in. So these are some of the critical issues that would, by way of policy, that could help to ignite growth in the country and reduce some of the fiscal pressures on the government and some of the fiscal pressures of the Barbadian households, who I'm sure are looking forward to more opportunities for employment, and also opportunities to invest for those who are so inclined.
Right. So thank you very much,
Kima, I know it's rough on Zoom sometimes, but I'm seeing a hand from Daniel Holder that's been up.
Yeah, I was just going to take the question from Daniel Holder. You can unmute.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Learn Fellows, for the insightful information you are giving. However, I don't want to be pessimistic in that I was hoping that I would get some ray of hope from the discussion that we can look forward to something tomorrow that will help citizens in Barbados to have a glimpse of hope relative to our economy. Carlos, you would have spoken just now about some of your wishes. And that too those are some of the wishes too I wish that we can hear about tomorrow. And that is that we are going to attract some degree of foreign investment into this country, and not that we are going to gloat on the strength that we can go and borrow from the foreign market continually, because it would appear that as we continue to gloat in that manner, that we are just digging ourselves into a death trap, where we are not seeing the vision where we are going to come out of it. And that is what I think that a number of citizens would like to know and would like to hear about. How are we going to emerge out of the debt that we are incurring to prop up our economy? Now, one of the areas that you just touched on is an area that I believe is of prime opportunity, not only on the local market, but maybe if we can get some foreign investors participating in that as well, would be good for us. And that is the renewable energy sector. I am hoping that I will hear from government that they have some plan how they will ignite further ignite the interest of both locals and probably foreign investors in that sector. Right now, we are going to be faced with increased oil prices. We are faced with Light and Power already telling us that the cost of electricity is going to go up. Already, the spending power of every citizen is being eroded. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, whether that is going to be a further impact on the citizenship of this country. So I'm looking that government will come up with some mechanism whereby it will stimulate further interest in and make it easier and speedier for persons to participate in the renewable energy sector. The other thing is, what is government doing about increasing the populace? And I'm not talking about encouraging persons to have babies. I'm talking about how are they looking at increasing the populace of this country so that we can have a greater economic pie to spread. Right now, our working populace, I believe, may be below 100,000. I'm not sure what the figure is right now, but how can we increase that number so that we can have a greater economies of scale in the country? There are a number of challenges within our economy. We don't have much resources. I don't want to hear from government any rhetoric about investment opportunities coming when we cannot identify any of those investment opportunities. I want to hear something solid for the citizens of this country to hold on to and say there is hope down the road, and that we are not kicking the can further down the road. I rest.
Thank you, Tanyo, for excellent contribution. I enjoyed every minute of your contribution. And given your input, I would have spoken previously about, again, the public financial management bill that the government tabled in 2019, which would have made changes possible within the legislation of Parliament. And they spoke about investment and investment strategies, and it is the government or the Minister of Finance's intention to table an investment management strategy, which should include all shares of potential government investments, etc. So I, like you, am looking forward to government to investment as it relates to capital investment, as it relates to making money for Barbados. This government has recorded the highest levels of revenue ever in the history of a government. So therefore, the populace is at its tax seat. So any intention to raise taxes on already shrinking tax base, where so many people are already unemployed, I think that would be disastrous. And mainly the poor people, the persons at the end of the economic scale, will feel the brunt. The middle class has been feeling the brunt and carrying the majority of the weight in Barbados for very long. And what we are seeing coming out in economic policy is a pivot over to the business community and passing legislation which will directly benefit them, as opposed to legislation which benefits workers. But I want to open the floor to any further questions and any further contributions from the panel as well. Jackson, you've gone quiet. So
Yes, I am here. Let me say that when you spoke about the financial bill, perfect opportunity. The government of Barbados is going to the international market through a PPP to acquire funding for the Grant Adams International Airport. What is an opportunity for Barbadians? And they are looking at $150 million through a PPP, 150 million US dollars. I thought that with all the initiatives of creating investment opportunities for Barbadians and for institutions, that the government would have utilized the services of the UWI. And Dr. Robinson, he is working to have the stock exchange more active, that they could have looked at issuing an IPO, an initial public offering, maintaining 55% of the shares in the airport, issuing that IPO for 45%, allowing Barbadians to buy shares in the airport as well, so that 45% could be split between what you call a private placement, individuals who may not want shares, but may decide that they are going to put $250,000, $500,000, $2 million as a debt to equity financing. And I'm confident that if the government had used that approach and have a listing on the Barbados Stock Exchange, the Trinidad Stock Exchange, and the OECS Stock Exchange, and have a US dollar portion open to Barbadians living outside of Barbados, we could have raised that $300 million and maintain the airport as our own. We are hearing that, yes, we are not going to lose it. But let me give you a quick example. If we had to go for a debt strategy with 150 million US dollars, that same monies 25 years down the road is going to cost the Barbados government $545 million. Now let us be rational. We're a country of 166 square miles is going to find $545 million 25 years down the road, although they say the PPP is going to be for 30 years, 25 years down the road to pay a PPP partner in order to acquire full control of the airport again. Now, the airport is a special purpose facility. It is a special purpose facility, and I'm one of those who believe that special purpose facilities should be kept within government full control. So that is an area where I am saying it is a perfect opportunity to give Barbadians to own, to have ownership, and it is not full ownership, to have part ownership of a facility like the airport.
Thank you very much, Jack. So that was a very interesting point, because part of the IMF approach to state-owned enterprises, and it's even registered in the public financial management bill again, the difference between the state-owned enterprises. So there's the commercial state-owned enterprises, and there's regular state-owned enterprises. And these commercial enterprises give the government opportunity to possibly make money and earn revenue. But with being under the IMF program, the intent is to reduce the size of the public service in Barbados, and the government would agree since 2018 to divest some of the government assets. We have regular state-owned enterprises and commercial state-owned enterprises as well. And for facilities, the Grant Adams International Airport, and then there was rumors about the Return Port, and then there was the Harrison's Cave, which was leased to a Jamaican company called Tours. We are now seeing an emergence of these public-private partnerships throughout the Barbados economy. I agree with PPPs. I think PPPs are indeed the way to go, a fusion between the public sector and the private sector. But leading back to my original point about transparency and investment strategy and government economic statement, and the importance of being a transparent government and reporting the economic activities of your day-to-day running. That will give the public an opportunity to contribute to the development of the country in a positive way, where the country or the people do not feel that they're being taken advantage of. So I just want to take a question here from Adrian, and then we're going to have our wrap-up session.
Hi, good evening to everyone out there. Good evening, Comrade Jepta. Good to see you. And first of all, congratulations to Kimar Stewart on that book that you would have written. I think it was a very well written book. And I look forward, Kimar, to getting my hands on a copy. Okay?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah. To add to what Jepta and the other gentleman would have said earlier, I smiled when I heard what he said. And with the PPP that you would have probably heard me spoke about on more than one occasion on brass tacks, and I questioned them about it. To some extent, it's okay, I agree with it. But if you have an administration that's not really fully engaging the society and the public at large on the day-to-day financial runnings of the country, and they just happily go merry along and make up whatever they're making up as they go along without actual proper consultation and given the okay by the electorate, because the people out here who are the bosses of them, but it seems to be the other way around. Okay, people aren't really knowing how their monies are being spent. We've seen over in the last financial year, the governor of the central bank, and I want to hear Kimar come in on this. He has given some forecasts that, to my mind, is quite questionable. And how, if you remember, in the year 2020, they pronounced that the economy was down by, and Kimar can correct me, by 20%. And if that was the case, by 20%, okay, that has been hit hard, and we continue to use the COVID-19 as a proverbial crutch to hold on to. Okay, how is it that you can still go out and borrow such huge, large amounts of money, okay, before even having to clear up your existing bills? And the question, I believe, as to add to the gentleman when he said that he don't want this in a death trap, I believe we're already in a death trap, because now we are looking to the United Arab Emirates. As you would have seen, if you really open your eyes, you see that there's a connection being made. Hence is why certain trips were taken by the current PM. Hence is why you see a lot of speeches and they're going to these countries and next countries. What do you think that is? Now Africa is looking to invest in here. So how is that really benefiting the everyday person? The trouble with the taxi operators. I spoke to a good couple of them today myself. One was very explanatory in how these fuel charges are going to hit them really hard. And now with the later power really wanting to send up, I mean, I want to hear from Kimar and here's what your take on that.
Thank you, comrade. I would not see trips to overseas countries as a bad thing to say. That is how links are made. That is how we gain access to bilateral investments, develop treaties, double taxation agreements. From one of our founding fathers, or the founding fathers said that we were friends of all and late of none. So we do have a history of diplomacy both regionally and internationally, and we never stay away from making friends on the international scene. So I just think the trip is a continuation of that. as it relates to the projections of the governor, I well, I guess the governor is being a bit optimistic, providing hope as it relates to the management of the economy and to keep confidence going, because confidence is a very important thing as it relates to the management of the economy. But there will come a time when we all, this would include just Professor Robinson and Carlos, even yourself and Dexter, we're going to have a serious conversation economically as to the new direction of Barbados. And this new direction involves less state responsibility to citizens and encouraging citizens to take on a greater financial role as it relates to your everyday living. So because your healthcare, there's potential for increases or potential for fees at point of sale. There is potential for increases in water bills, as Dr. Clay Marshall said on Brass Tacks, that the reason for him being on the 20-mile water committee is to find the correct price for water. So that is signaling that an increase in the price of water is coming, and that's a possibility within the budget. And with the oil prices again at $130, Barbados again is facing another serious crisis as it relates to gas, use of oil and gas. So that hampers not only household usage but business usage as well. And with the garbage and sewage tax being a noose around the necks of farmers and other small businesses, it continues to squeeze the life of persons who live in everyday Barbados. And some new direction and some some serious changes will need to be made when we get to the point that the war has taken its toll. We cannot get the tourism numbers back up to scratch, and we are not producing anything to really suffice ourselves, and that is the point where we're going to have to definitely form a new direction for Barbados. I would open the floor to the panelists, and then we're going to wind down. So I ask everybody to give the final contributions. So I will answer your question, Adrian.
I'll touch on Adrian's question about the growth forecast for this year, and I'll tie in my response with a question that I saw in the chat from former Minister Maxine McLean, who made the point that the current estimates were prepared before the current Russian-Ukraine war and the economic implications that has presented. And therefore she's asking what problems will that pose. So basically the economic implications resulting from the war were not foreseen when the estimates were prepared, and therefore some adjustment may have to be made. And maybe that too may be why the government has finally recognized or appreciated the importance of having a budget, notwithstanding the silly comments made by Dr. Greenidge and the Prime Minister about there being no need for the budget because there are estimates and reported to the IMF. Of course, we can all dismiss that for what it is. If not, there will be no budget tomorrow either, if that we are to follow that logic. The answer to Ms. McLean's question is yes, there would be some adjustment. It is why, even without contemplating this war and its implications, Professor Robinson and I earlier, and me in another place, have expressed some reservation or concernation that you would create estimates with a planned deficit of 3.3% of GDP with implications of financing needs of 800 million, and with revenue projections in the estimates of about 7%, it begged the question, what is the growth forecast? Was the assumption that the estimate revenue projections would have been based on? Now, if it was based on the 10% growth that was indicated in the government's financial reporting, that pre-election reporting that came out, then we know that there are downside risks, because if there are other outbreaks of the COVID pandemic that scuttles the accommodations industry, or lead to tax restrictions or what have you, those are what we would call in economics downside risks, and therefore you should plan a more conservative budget that gives you a buffer in the event that your revenue projections don't actually materialize. Of course, the opposite is true, and if the economy should grow more robustly than is projected, the actual deficit would be lower than what is planned. So it was against that background that the concerns expressed by myself and Professor Robinson with respect to planning a deficit of 3.3% in the context of an IMF program that calls for reducing the debt burden over time, that perhaps is not a prudent approach. And I would expect that the budget would outline any adjustments given the new reality of the economic implications of surging commodity prices and the slowdown in growth globally that would result from the ongoing war. With respect to the growth projection of 10%, a few things I would like to say very quickly. So the latest central bank report, the revision for 2020 decline is just 16.4% or 16% decline. So it wasn't actually 17 or 20. There's nothing nefarious about that. As data comes in and you get better information over time, these numbers are often revised. So it seems as if the economy declined by 16% rather than 20% in 2020. And most of that economic decline was just due to the economy being shut down by way of government policy, not only in Barbados, but in other parts of the world due to lockdowns. And therefore, once the economy reopens, and in the case of Barbados, travel returns close to normal levels, then you can see growth shooting up just as quickly as it declined in 2020. And we would call that base effects. So there's a low base that the economy is at, meaning it shrank quite considerably. And to the extent that it normalizes, you can have significant double-digit growth this year. It's totally possible, but it is conditioned on how the COVID pandemic is managed in Barbados and globally. It does appear that we're on our way out of it. And more recently, the implications of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. And again, we speak to these things as downside risks, which means that the economy, even though it is quite possible to grow at that magnitude and at that pace, because of these emergent issues and the uncertainty globally, that the actual growth could actually be lower. And you may or may not have noticed that the central bank in its last report did not actually express a figure, a growth figure. They just said double digit. And in the Q&A, the governor was quite cautious about putting a figure out there because they also recognize that the environment is quite uncertain, and forecasting in this type of environment is somewhat difficult. But what it all underscores again, it is why is imperative that the government in its outlays of expenditure for the next fiscal year and its revenue projections, it would be prudent that they be more conservative as a buffer for the possibility of these downside effects actually materializing. And it would be prudent management to do it that way too, because if things turn out as rosy as you project, or even better, then the outturn would be better than what you actually presented. So there is all the prospect with respect to these estimates that some supplementals may be needed by the time you get near to the end of the financial year, or the government may actually have to be a little more conservative on its spending, though planned in the budget. Government may have to walk back or tailor back some of its spending so that we proceed in a manner where we are a little more fiscally cautious and prudent given the scale of uncertainty. That, however, should not disavow any press where possible to stimulate growth in terms of the government's capital program and also the attraction of foreign direct investment.
Thank you very much, Carlos. That was a very excellent wrap up. Conrad, you heard myself, you answered your question excellently better than me as it relates to the governor's central bank. So it was good. It was good, Carlos. I see Conrad is splitting, so he appreciates that. Again, viewers, you're here. You're entering into our final lap. We have our final two presenters to contribute, but I just wanted to pause for a moment to say thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the engagement. Thank you for the questions. We had one last contribution from Maxine McLean, and she's saying that Africa is the future, with a projected middle class across the continent of 500 million, and its fastest growing economies being Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana. The place where the bulk of the world's young population can be found, along with a very significant African diaspora in North America and Europe. We would be foolish to ignore the place where the developing world is flocking. And Maxine, I want to agree with you. I think Africa is the future of the world, and if we could develop trade corridors directly from Barbados to Africa, I think that would be a very beneficial thing that we can do. And one very important thing that occurred in February of 2019 as well, I believe, Barbados was signed on to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. I'm not, but I know we all should be familiar with what the Belt and Road yes, thank you. Yes. Also, we would have signed on to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and this global initiative has provided Barbados the opportunity to have direct trade relationships with China and to Africa and the different connected routes as it relates to other countries who would have signed on. So there's options, there's opportunities out there, but it comes back down to Barbados and its policy choices. We're gonna have Dr. Robinson to give his final comments, and then you're gonna ask Dexter to wrap up after him.
Okay, thanks again. Thanks for the opportunity to engage. The estimates show a deficit of 3.3%, which is inconsistent with Barbados' stated economic strategy of achieving a debt to GDP ratio of 60% by 2033. So I would expect the budget to have some austerity measures to attempt to close that gap. And then the Minister of Finance task has been made significantly more difficult by the developments in Ukraine with the Ukraine-Russia war, which is exposing the world to a possible global recession and exposing the economy to some degree of relapse, just as it was coming out or seeking to come out of COVID-19. So I would expect the growth predictions for 2022 to be lower now because of the developments in Ukraine. So I would also expect the budget to try to facilitate, promote investment and growth opportunities that don't involve the direct use of public finances, where the government is playing more a role of facilitating, because it clearly doesn't have the fiscal space to spend money to do a lot of investment of the scale required. So I expect some selected growth initiatives. But the fact that the oil prices and commodity prices are going up also means that the cost of living is seeing a sharp increase. So I would expect some targeted measures to protect the most vulnerable, to give them an ease. I would expect the government, for example, to implement the cap on the price of gasoline at the pump. I certainly would expect something like that, and other measures that are targeted to protect the most vulnerable. So I think it's going to be a very difficult balancing act for the Minister of Finance to square all of those objectives, to stay within the IMF targets, to stay on course to debt to GDP of 60%, to stimulate economic growth, as well as provide an ease to the most vulnerable, all in this difficult global environment with an economy that is very weak coming out of COVID. And I don't envy her task. I think it will be extremely difficult balance. And I think many are likely to not get as much as they want. So I think there might be a little something for everybody, but not enough. So I expect some disappointment.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Robinson. That was a very interesting perspective. And I just wanted to ask you finally, what about the Barbados' signature to the Biden tax plan, which would have increased international business built back up to 15%? And what are the implications of that also coming out in the budget as well?
Well, I don't know the extent to which that will be addressed in the budget. I don't know. I don't know what the timeline is for that. But again, that's another negative for Barbados, because the international business sector was one of the sectors that the tax revenues held up very well during COVID-19. So any developments that undermine the competitiveness of that sector and the ability to generate that tax revenue is another major challenge. And it will be interesting to hear in the budget whether the government, what is an update on that, what's the timeline, and what is our strategic response in terms of tax policy to protect that very important sector for Barbados.
Carlos, you just want to give a quick 30-second contribution to that question before we move on to Getford?
Yeah, I endorse what Professor Robinson said. What I would add is that that agreement hasn't been implemented as yet globally. I'm not sure of the timeline either, but the point is that there are no immediate implications of that, even though we've read about it in the media, that most of the G20 and others have signed on it. So certainly it would be useful if the Prime Minister address it more or less as an anticipation the next year or the year after, when it comes into effect, how the government may be contemplating to deal with it. I am not that too concerned about that prospect though, and I probably have a contrarian perspective where that development is concerned, but suffice to say that it could be addressed by tax credits targeted to foreign exchange earning industries that ultimately reduces the effective tax rate, even though the stated tax rate is 15%. So there are other taxation policies that can be used to work around that for the industry in particular. And for me, to the extent that that is done or can be done, I see no reason why it shouldn't be possible, because those instruments are within the US tax code and the Canadian tax code and so on. Um, the positive could be is that the corporate tax rate for non-interest earning, non-exchange rate earning companies go back up. You know, because dropping it to 5.5%, I thought was a little knee-jerk in the first instance. And the reason that the Biden administration raised this issue, there's been a race to the bottom in terms of corporate taxation. And I think corporations do have to pay the fair share of taxation as opposed to shifting the burden more and more on individuals. So I look forward to see how the policy space in that, the policy framework in that regard is shaped. But I'm not particularly worried in terms of the eventuality once it is done right.
Thank you. Jack, so we left you for last. We're going to let you land the plane here. So in your synopsis, you know, anything you want to add, contribute?
Yeah, let me say first, thanks for the opportunity. And for me, as far as when we look at the budgetary proposals that are going to be presented tomorrow, I am of the opinion that the Prime Minister is going to prepare Barbadians for the rest of the year and for 2023, based on what I have seen as far as the balance sheet, not the article for consultation, what the balance sheet on Barbados from the IMF is saying. And in addition to that, we have had an environment that is very hostile. This economic environment is hostile, highly speculative. We are grappling with the energy costs. But may I say, and I'm going to be political at this time, that under a Democratic Labour Party government from 2008 to 2015, when the price of a barrel of oil, and I want people to remember, moved from $45 to $200 a barrel, the former Prime Minister, Further Jerome Stewart, and his finance minister, along with cabinet members, we absorbed $100 million in energy costs. We absorbed it, and I could remember the Barbados Labour Party and Mr. Clyde Maskell was saying that we were going to bankrupt BNOC, that we were going to destroy the economy. We demitted office in 2018. The money was repaid, and BNOC is still active today, and we still have a Barbados economy. So what I am saying is that the government, I am looking forward for the government of Barbados in that budget to absorb the energy costs on the behalf of the people of Barbados. Because if we don't, we are going to see with the spiraling costs of living, then we are going to have an inflation problem that we're going to have to deal with. But overall, I am not looking for any gives away. It is tight. It is when you look at the borrowings internationally, it is very tight. And we are going to have to prepare ourselves. We have to deal with the amendment to the Pensions Act that I think government is fancy for working around. We have to face it. It has to come. These are the things that I think that the budget is going to present tomorrow.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Dexter. Your very political contribution, but still very valuable. And that'll be all. I think you all learned quite a bit today from all of the panelists, even the contributors who would have contributed, Maureen, Adrian, and it was kind of older. We learned from this very rich engagement, and this is what the Democratic Labour Party is all about, providing the platform to bring the facts, to bring the education to your doorstep, so that you have the adequate information, you're armed with the facts. So tomorrow when the Prime Minister delivers the budget, which will be around 3 p.m., you can listen out with a keen ear. You can listen out on the facts, and you can get yourself a copy of the estimates of Barbados, and you're going to see it as possible for our IT person to place those estimates on the Democratic Labour Party page, so that you can draw down and have yourselves a peruse you can contact any member of the Democratic Labour Party if you want any further explanations, if you want to ask any questions. We're available to take your questions as it relates to any aspect, not just the economy, politics, law, business. We have a very professional person. You met three very professional gentlemen this evening who were very knowledgeable in their contributions. And I just want to say this is what we are about. This is what we will be about going forward as a relates to Democratic Labour Party. And Tuesday, you can look forward to a proper and adequate response from the Democratic Labour Party as it relates to the delivery of the budgetary proposals tomorrow. So again, thank you very much for tuning in. I just want to say good evening to you one more time. Thank you to our President Steve. I see our former president, Mr. Caesar, is locked on, so I want to say good evening to her, and thank you for tuning in. Thank the panel one more time, and good evening to you. I had a good evening, and I hope to see you again shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right,
Good evening,
thank
everyone.
you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
All right,
Take care.
Justin.
Thanks, everyone. It was a great evening.